Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Collective Impact Forum, I'd like to welcome you to the webinar series, Getting Started with Collective Impact, presented by FSG. My name is Robert Albright, Associate Director of the Collective Impact Forum, and it's a real pleasure to be welcoming you today. We have a terrific program for you today with a great group of speakers, but before we get started, I wanted to touch base on a few items. Over the course of this webinar series, we'll be talking a lot about collective impact, highlighting initiative stories and presenting tools and methods for you to use. We encourage you to sign up for the Collective Impact Forum, a free resource for people and organizations to access tools, training opportunities, and peer networks. In fact, if you haven't already, we encourage you to tab over to the Collective Impact Forum right now in order to download today's presentation deck and handout material. You can click on the box on the bottom right of this screen. The presenters will be walking you through a worksheet in the handout material, and we encourage you to have this printed by your side. Today's program is 90 minutes long, and we encourage you to stay engaged with our presenters by answering polls and asking questions. Periodically, our presenters will ask you a poll like this. The question is, how many people are watching at your location? We'll pause for a moment while you fill in the number into the box. Hopefully that's popping up for you. Thank you. Hopefully that's a pretty easy exercise, and we'll have other polls like this coming up throughout the webinar. Other than polls, we want to hear your questions and comments. Submit them at any time during the presentation in the box on the lower left corner of the screen. You may also upvote others' questions or favorite those that you agree with that are important to be discussed. The presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as time allows during the Q&A. You'll also see a Twitter feed on the right-hand side of your screen, and we encourage you to join the conversation on Twitter using #CollectiveImpact. If you need technical assistance during the webinar, you can chat directly with support using the Text Support chat tab at the lower left corner of the screen, or you may email KRM support at custserve@krm.com. Last, this event is being recorded, and you will receive the recording link to your email after the conclusion of today's webinar. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. John?
Thanks, Robert. Hello, everyone. This is John Kania from FSG, and let me add my welcome to Robert's. Glad you all could join us today. Could we switch to the next slide, please? So our focus for today is this notion of setting the scene for collective impact, and essentially how do we get started with the process. And if we're on the slide that says the 3 key questions, here's what we're going to be covering today. How do we identify champions and form a cross-sector group? How do we invite them, specifically those folks who we want to join the steering committee? And how do we include the voices of community members? So if we could switch to the next slide, please. So today you'll be hearing from 3 people. First of all, me. This is John Kania. I'm Managing Director at FSG. I research, write, publish, and consult on collective impact, among other things, and I'm delighted to be here. The 2 panelists who are joining me are Cheryl McCarver, who is the backbone leader and executive director of the Health and Wellness Alliance for Children, which is a collective impact effort focused on improving the health and well-being of children in Dallas and Collin counties. Cheryl came to her current position as the backbone leader for this effort, actually as a steering committee member herself, where she was representing the YMCA of Metropolitan Dallas as the Vice President of Community Health and Well-Being. So she brings a wealth of experience in terms of both working with the community and more recently engaging in the effort of collective impact. Also joining us is Erin White. Erin is an associate director at FSG, one of our experienced consultants in the area of collective impact, and Erin has led the launch of collective impact efforts in a variety of areas, including teen substance abuse, early childhood learning, and child obesity prevention. Next slide, please. So let's start by addressing the question of what is so important about the steering committee. Next slide, please. So typically we see 4 key responsibilities that the steering committee members take on. The first is to provide strategic guidance to the overall effort. The steering committee is typically the group of individuals in the community that has a bird's eye view or a helicopter view of what's going on with the initiative. They are really there to represent the perspectives of the community. Importantly, we talk about strategic guidance and not hierarchical control or ordering people around. There is nobody, no one individual or even group that is in charge, if you will, of a collective impact effort. But you do want a representative set of people that actually can provide strategic guidance to the initiative, and that certainly is one of the roles that steering committee members play. The second is to review data and develop a learning agenda. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the various sort of processes that take place over the course of a collective impact initiative. And the steering committee role will vary from over time from initially starting to gather information about what's going on in the community to actually developing on behalf of the community a common agenda for the effort, to then facilitating and providing guidance on an ongoing basis and continuing to assist the initiative with learning and with a learning agenda. The third area of responsibility is working closely with the backbone organization. Folks may know that in collective impact efforts, typically we highlight one of the conditions of success, having an organization or set of resources that we call the backbone, whose sole purpose is the alignment and coordination of all the players in the effort. And the steering committee plays a role both in sort of providing guidance and direction to the backbone and helping with that alignment and coordination. And finally, the steering committee members are really responsible for championing the effort to key stakeholders and influencers in the community. Next slide, please. So there are a few best practices for steering committee members. When we think about what constitutes an effective steering committee. The first is typically there are 2 co-chairs. Sometimes there may be more. We ideally like to see more than one individual who's chairing the effort. And when we think about multiple co-chairs or 2 co-chairs, ideally they're from different sectors and represent different constituencies. Number 2 says meetings at least quarterly. Actually, we would suggest that earlier in the effort, when data is initially being collected about the community and the challenge and problems that are being faced with a particular issue that's being addressed, and the common agenda is being developed, that often the steering committee will meet as frequently as monthly, but on an ongoing basis, we talk about meeting at least quarterly. Third practice around steering committees, that we're looking for a diverse cross-sectoral membership. Often when we think about groups that come together to address a specific social issue, we think about those players that are in the nonprofit sector, or maybe we include philanthropy and funders. But really critical to also have government and business at the table. One of my colleagues who does a lot of collective impact work says, if you want a really boring conversation about how to create change against a specific issue, invite just people from one sector, like just the nonprofit sector, or just the business sector, or just government. If you want a really interesting conversation, get a cross-sector set of people together who look at the issue from different sides, and boy, you'll find some interesting perspectives, and I've really found that to be the case. Fourth best practice is really around coordinated activities. We are looking for members of the steering committee to see the connections in their work, and this should happen naturally with good structure, which is part of what we're unrolling in this introductory series, is how to think about structuring these efforts well. Fifth best practice, regular communication. We're really talking about continuous communication, and clearly the steering committee and the backbone play key roles in regular communication. Reporting out to the community on a regular basis, keeping the community abreast and involved, and a commitment to learning. The progress of collective impact is iterative. The steering committee is not purely about evaluation and accountability. It is principally about learning to get better and address the issue more effectively over time. And really what the steering committee is about is a dedication to having all members of the effort and the community get better, smarter, faster. Next slide, please. So next we're going to talk about how do we determine who to invite. Next slide, please. So we talk about starting with good data to help you determine who to invite. So, make sure you do your homework in terms of who should be part of the initiative. First, we want to look at the demographics. We want the steering committee to be representative of the population of the issue we are trying to serve. So race, ethnicity, gender, other key groupings within the population. We want to understand what this looks like in the community against the issue that we're trying to address and take that into consideration when we think about the steering committee. We want important stakeholders. We like to say if you want to change the system, get the system in room. So think about who are key stakeholders that actually can affect change in the community. Third is we want to understand information about the problem. Again, if we want data about who should we invite to be on the steering committee, we need to have at least some level of understanding about the problem to understand which constituencies might be represented. For example, actually Erin, Cheryl, and I have all worked on child obesity in Dallas. And, when we think about child obesity, there are a bunch of different dimensions to the problem. There's things like understanding sort of, how kids can better exercise, what are sort of more effective ways they can eat and gain better nutrition. So thinking about sort of representatives from the world of exercise, from the world of nutrition, and the different systems that are involved in child obesity prevention, the health system, the education system, thinking about the municipal infrastructure, all these things, getting a little bit of a sense, more than a little bit of a sense of what's driving things in the problem so that we can invite representative players from different areas of the system. Next slide, please. So there are a few questions you can ask to identify members, and here we'll talk about three. One, what organizations or individuals represent pieces of the system that we're trying to change? If we want to change the system, get the system in the room. Who has decision-making authority? And three, who has relationships and networks that are relevant to the work? Our colleagues in Canada, the Tamarack Institute for Community Change, one of the co-catalysts for the Collective Impact Forum, have an exercise they like to do when they establish or support the establishment of steering committees called the 100-person exercise. So take these three questions. Get yourselves and a number of members that of the community who would have good insight into these questions into a room with a whiteboard, and start by building up a list of people around these three questions. Maybe get to 100 people, and then call that list to get the best distributive representation. That's a great way to think about establishing a steering committee. Next slide, please. I talked about this a little bit before. It's vital to have a multi-sector steering committee. So on the left-hand side, you'll see single sector. Many coalitions around social change often are just NGOs, but what we're really talking about in collective impact is a multi-sector effort that includes nonprofits, philanthropy, government business. This is where challenging to sort of pull a set of players together across sector and to have conversations across sector, but it's absolutely critical. And in some respects, my experience has been that the conversations become actually even more honest about what's going on, because in some respects, the different sectors will want to sort of hold each other accountable, and also we'll see things from a different perspective. No one sector created the challenges that we face, and we need multiple sectors to solve them. Next slide, please. Here are some ideal characteristics of steering committee members. We want them to be decision makers. We want them to be representative of key sectors of the community, influential champions. We want them to be experts on content and also the context of what's going on in the community. Often they are practitioners and professionals and also residents that are in and around the issue. They need to have passion and urgency for the issue. They need to be focused on the greater interests of the community, the health of the whole, and they need a commitment to the issue and to learning. So we're going to poll all of you at this point. For those who have already are currently putting together a steering committee, the question is, what data have you used to understand who to bring to the table? And we'll have some options come up in a second here as we launch this poll. So you'll see hopefully on your screen that what data have you used to understand who to bring to the table. Then you'll see some options: local quantitative data, numbers that describe the problem in your community; national quantitative data that describe the problems nationally; local qualitative data; national qualitative data, and you haven't started using data yet. Well, it's kind of interesting when you look at the results. People are using a variety of different data sources, just as we've talked about, you know, numbers are sort of moving around as they tabulate up, but we're really seeing that, you know, all of these different sources are being used, including, haven't started using data yet. Of course, you're probably still getting your effort up and running. But, you know, I think this is illustrative, right, of the fact that, you know, it's not, there's no specific formula for figuring out who to get, who should be a part of this effort, but there are a variety of different sources. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Cheryl to talk a little bit about her experience in terms of bringing a steering committee together in Dallas.
Sure. Thanks, John, and thanks for forwarding the slide. As John said, I started this work as part of the steering committee myself before becoming one of the backbone team members. And really important to this work as you look to build your steering committee is, as he said, including a cross-sector of leaders. So as you can see from our slide, we've got a vast diversity of leaders around the table, from our healthcare organizations, health systems, school districts, government agencies, social services, child care providers, and of course our faith-based organizations. So we looked at our data and wanted to make sure that as we build this team of folks that would help bring guidance and direction to our work, that we really had those decision makers. And these are folks that can really get at the systems change as we focused on our initial initiative around asthma. So we were looking at the asthma initiative here in Dallas and how that impacts our children. So we launched our work with the help of Children's Health System, doing what we call the Meet the Neighbors, and I'll speak a little bit more about that in a minute. But I was part of those conversations, thinking about how might I join this work, how might I look at what I do when we touch the lives of the kids at the YMCA, and how do I interact with these other core folks around the table. And one of the core things as you look to build your steering committee, it's all about relationships. It's all about meeting people where they are in their work and helping them understand that the connection between where you're trying to go and what they're currently doing is very important to moving the needle. So relationships is a really key component of looking to build your steering committee. If you will progress the slides, please. So as we look at the next slide, one of the core things for us was understanding the problem, and that helped us identify our members. And as I said, we started with asthma as our initial focus area, and this is a really cool demonstration of, even though we were looking at a critical issue around asthma, our child and our family was at the core of this work. So from that first slide, you saw that the YMCA was part of the work, and we looked at grabbing a hold to those folks that really touched our children and our families. To the right of this screen, you see that asthma management is created by the doctors, school nurses, community health workers. So they were core too as we looked at who should be around the table. And I think this illustrates that our providers are really trying to balance the triggers that impact our kids. So we then started thinking about, boy, if we're going to be working on lowering ED visits, what are those triggers and what are those issues that and environments that impact our children around asthma. So we brought on folks that really are really key to the environment where the children live, where they learn, where they worship, and they play. And we'll speak a little bit about the city of Dallas as they were part of that. We looked at all of those things that impact our kids from indoor environment, outdoor environment, and their school environment. So those are key players that were around the table from the beginning to help us get at this work, even the EPA. One of the great things about our work in Dallas, we had lots of collaboratives that were already working in silos. So it was really easy to start looking at bringing them in to focus on one single issue and look at this from a collective impact lens. So that also helped us identify key members because they were currently engaged in our community and they were currently working on some issues and around the table. So that helped us look at who should we bring around the table, what is the data telling us, and those same core folks helped us identify the gaps even in our steering committee. Who else should be around the table? Who else should we be thinking about? Erin?
Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Cheryl. So Cheryl gave a great description of sort of how that steering committee came together, and I think a critical part of both the steering committee focused on asthma and many others coming together is the magic invitation. How do we actually get these folks to come to the table? So as I begin this section, wanted to actually start with a poll, because oftentimes we find that one sector or another might be more challenging for you and your community. And so your options are business, the nonprofit sector, foundations or philanthropy, government, or residents, community members themselves. So just a quick poll on who's been a struggle for you to bring to the table. Wow, overwhelming early response on business community. Not surprising there. We've heard that before. Interesting. So I think noticing an early trend here as folks are still replying, but certainly the business community can be a challenge. And I think what we found with business is that you really do have to think about the bottom line. Going to one of Cheryl's earlier points about understanding where an entity is and how their day job or their work connects to the whole. Sometimes business might not be involved at the outset in a steering committee. Sometimes it takes getting to really specific strategies in order to better understand how business can be involved. There might be a particular area, I'm thinking in some substance abuse work, where we had pharmacies, which are businesses, involved in some of the solutions. But early on, there wasn't necessarily an opportunity for them to come to the table. So sometimes you do have to get to that level of specificity. Sometimes you just need one businessman. You just need one business person, I should say, who's willing to go out and ask his or her colleagues to join the effort. I think another area that it looks like folks are struggling to bring people to the table with is just residents and community members. I think we often will bring the system leaders in the room, but perhaps overlook that group. And if you are trying to engage residents and community members, particularly those who have the lived experience of the problem, you might need to think about structuring meetings differently. Maybe they're at a time when folks are off work or having childcare available. We'll get a little more into engaging community later in the presentation, but it's definitely something to have in mind as you're forming the committee to structure it in a way that invites those folks who you need to hear from most. Next slide, please. So thinking about that invitation, you want to go out there, and first of all, I'd strongly suggest an in-person invitation. Nothing makes people feel more welcomed than actually having a conversation as opposed to simply receiving an email. To go to meet with that individual, particularly at their place of work, if you have that ability. Maybe there are a few folks who are early champions on the work, and you can go out and do it together. But coming to that conversation prepared is really key. So a few things you might want to be prepared with. One is just data on the problem. Early on, that poll that John launched showed that many of you are looking at local data, both quant and qual, that really helps you understand the impact of the problem in your community. Coming with a couple of stats in mind, you don't have to have a fully a fully laid out data plan, but coming with a few statistics and maybe even some stories, of lives impacted by the problem. That can be a powerful way to bring people in. The second thing that you want to come prepared with is information about collective impact. Folks may have said, gosh, I think I heard about that. Is that a buzzword? What is this thing? You want to bring information about collective impact, particularly how this feels different from prior attempts at collaboration. So a community may have had many prior coalitions on the same issue. How is this going to be different? And one way it's different is actually to focus on structure and process, on the importance of a good representative steering committee, on the importance of data. So those are things you might point to help people get excited about another committee meeting, so to speak. The third thing you want to come prepared with is an understanding of who else is at the table, really looking at the landscape of individuals and saying, okay, sometimes it's really helpful for a group to say that, wow, this other important community member is present. Maybe I should join on. It's the jumping on the moving train effect of saying there are a few important members and we really want to be part of that entity. The final piece is just sharing the unique role that person's organization can play. So each organization is bringing a unique perspective, right, or else you wouldn't be asking them to join. So call that out. Say, I need you here because of this perspective that you bring on the problem, or because of this service that you share with their community. And, I know that you are, if you're a health entity, perhaps you're looking to get more involved in delivering health to a certain population. This work will help you learn more about that population. Really make the pitch both to what their needs are and also to what role they will play within the effort. Next slide, please. So a couple of best practices for this invitation. In addition to being prepared as you come in, just be ready to describe the purpose for the effort, and that might be where using data comes in. Be sure to be very explicit after you've done your research on the perspective. Be very explicit about what perspectives they'll bring. Share with them some of the practical aspects of being a steering committee member. That's items 3 and 4. What's the commitment on terms of time? What am I signing up for? Am I signing up for 6 months, or am I signing up for a year? And also share what the expectation is in terms of leadership. As John mentioned earlier, we're really looking to get sectors in the room and leaders in the room, people who are networked, and people who are willing to potentially make a change in the way they do their own work in order to help achieve the overall goal. So really starting to lay out that commitment from that first conversation is an effective way of moving forward. Now I'm going to turn it back to Cheryl to talk a little bit about some of those lessons that she learned from going door to door. Cheryl?
Thank you, Erin. So as our slide says, we started our work in Dallas first, and we've spread to Collin County within the last couple months, and we really have made an effort to look at what did we learn when we started Dallas and what can we do as we move into Collin County to really solidify a strong start. So during our Meet the Neighbor phase, one of the things we did was we asked the folks that we met with, and we chose those folks for Meet the Neighbor that were key influencers in our Collin County community, folks that were around the table when we looked at the data around the health of our children. And we have a resource here called Beyond ABC, and it's a report that Children's Health System puts out that really gets at some core critical areas or core areas of wellness for our children, like safety and security, food insecurity, health and economic security, those things, homelessness. So those were some of the core data points, and we selected our Meet the Neighbor team from those data points. And we asked them, what's working well in Collin County? How's it going for you? And so in doing that, we were able to garner their thoughts and really use some of the core questions that Erin spoke of on the previous slide, letting them know we needed them around the table and talking about how we were going to show up. one of the things you might notice that Children's Health System was our sponsor of this work. So it was really important that we showed up in a way that didn't say that Children's Health was taking over the initiative or Children's Health was coming to do something better than any of the other organizations who have been doing this work for quite a long time. So it was more about ensuring that we were partnering, ensuring that we needed them, and looking to ask more questions than to provide answers. So we used this Meet the Neighbor to build our list of who we wanted to have around the table. We also considered bright spots. So with our asthma work in Dallas, those were clear gaps in where families needed help around the environment or where they needed help around care management. In Collin County, we decided to really target areas where great work was being done so that we came across as celebrating the success that's already happening in our neighboring community. So that was one of the, I would say, one of the most important ways to look at the work, because who doesn't want to celebrate the great work, and who doesn't want to be part of a collaborative that recognizes the strength that you bring to the table? Again, our data was driving who we spoke with. Our data was telling us what some of the core issues were in Collin County. And the other thing that we learned that was different in Collin County than Dallas was that Collin County really was a benchmark when we looked at what they did well. So it's really interesting to make sure we presented the story that we wanted to ensure that the children in Collin County stayed ranked really high when we looked at that data. And we also looked at those indicators that said there was opportunity to improve, and that happened to be around obesity. We have yet to decide on our focus for Collin County, but we certainly are bringing the folks around the table to help us build the initiative out and include names and resources and a list of folks that we can approach to grow. So one of the things I will also speak about as you move into your steering committee is understand that early on in your work, you are building a team that will help you create a list to grow. So as you start work around work groups or you haven't identified your strategies, you really need a group of people who can give you a lot of time in their best thinking, and you want folks that have an experience around the work so they can look at what's missing, who's missing. Do you know of any evidence-based practices that we might model and spread as we align our activities, and where else is there data in our community that we can share and use to create a larger footprint for impact? One last lesson that I'd like to share with you as we moved into Collin County. I've noticed that in Dallas, we started with a really great core group of folks. And as we've moved into execution and launching of our strategy, it really is time to look at things from a systems leadership approach. So now we're looking at our steering committee in a way that says, who else should we be bringing on around the table at a higher level, folks that really are those decision makers around the key organizations in our community that impact our children. So as you begin the work, you may have a different makeup of your steering committee from the level of the folks and their ability to make decisions, because they're really working hard at kind of the startup entrepreneurial approach to this work. And as you move into sustainability and systems change, you might consider beginning that list of folks that are more of your C-suite leaders who you might want to meet with only quarterly to help you totally change policy and totally change the way that those big box systems are showing up. So that kind of gets at the lessons from Dallas and Collin County. And now I'm going to go back to Erin, or actually John. I believe, John, you've got a question for us, correct?
Yeah, it's so great. Cheryl and Erin, that's both really super descriptions of how to start thinking about this. So we have time now to take questions from the audience as they come in. So feel free to type a question in, and we will try to take those that come through. But maybe just for starters, there was questions for both Erin and Cheryl. Erin, a question came up, or Cheryl, maybe you have perspective on this as well, in terms of the different sectors to involve with faith-based. How important is that, and, some of the challenges or opportunities of bringing faith-based community to the table?
Great question, and the faith-based community is really important. And as we began our work in Dallas, we had quite a few members from the faith-based community present. And as our work got further along, those folks weren't as engaged as I would have liked. And one of the I think contributing factors for me was that we targeted smaller entities. So it's really hard to have someone who is the sole leader of an organization to be involved at the level that we really want a steering committee member to be involved. So the faith-based community is really key because your work, in order to sustain it, you want to have those partners like schools, faith-based, and other organizations that aren't typically around the table, yet they impact and make decisions and touch our children and families. But be strategic about how you engage them. You might select a larger church body that has, like a mega church, because they have the capacity and the staff resources to be a part of the work for the long haul.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. So maybe a question for both of you. I think, we've talked about the different sort of, if you will, demographics of identifying steering committee members. How do you think about, we're looking for people that are leaders, are strong in advocating for the issue, but are also evenly balanced in that they may have a strong point of view about, perhaps how the issue might be addressed, but they're willing and open to hear diverse perspectives. Either of you, any thoughts on how can you identify that up front when you're trying to think about who you should involve?
I'll take that, John. This is Erin. So I think early on, there's certainly that balance of the ideal group and then the group that is made of people, and we know that people are not perfect. So sometimes there might be an organization or a sector that's really critical to involve, but there might be some super strong personalities who potentially could dominate meetings or maybe aren't coming in, bringing sort of their best self to the meeting and to the work. So you have a few options. One is to make the judgment call that, actually this organization is not critical. They're not part of sort of the system problem, and thus it's not as critical to engage them. So that's one option, certainly. Just don't invite them to the party, so to speak. But more likely than not, this is actually an organization or a sector who you need to invite. And I just to share a story that might help illustrate a potential approach was once helping to build a steering committee. I was serving a little bit as the facilitator backbone role, and there was someone who felt very passionately about the issue. He would show up in every meeting and would say some sort of similar points, maybe in different ways each time. And I finally just talked to him. I talked to him after the meeting one day, and I said, look, I so appreciate your passion for this issue, but frankly, I mean, one, it gets a little old to hear the same thing every time, and two, maybe there's something we're doing wrong as a group that we're not actually hearing you. So let's have a conversation. We had a lengthy conversation. I better understood his questions and concerns. And after that, he knew that I might give him a couple of minutes in the meeting, but that if I turned to him and said, I think we need someone else to speak, he understood because I was doing that relationship building, that it came from a place of love and of welcome, but also that we really did need to hear from other people. So sometimes it's just the time needed, I think, in relationship, that if there is that difficult person you have to have, that time really can pay off.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I know we've gotten a bunch of questions about how do you handle difficult steering committee members, and you went immediately to that. There's sort of the question of if there's somebody important and critical, but we know they're difficult, should we invite them to the steering committee? And then, once they're on, how do we actually work with them? And I think part of what you've said, you're actually going to have to spend some extra time there, and need to figure out whether or not you can help this individual become, a productive player. That appears to be what we've seen in a number of different instances. I'm going to, we've got a bunch of different questions, but we'll be moving on shortly into the next section. But before we move there, one of the questions that we got is sort of how do you distinguish between the backbone and the steering committee? Either of you want to handle that?
This is Cheryl, and early on, as we said, I started out being part of the steering committee and then was hired on as backbone lead. And we did a great job. If you refer to that first part of our slide deck, your backbone or steering committee members really help guide and give direction. They help us look through the lens of those 5 tenets of collective impact to align our activities and find ways to share data. That really helps us. The backbone team is really core to getting the work done. In most collaboratives, as you all know, you don't have a team of folks doing the work from 9 to 5. So sometimes the backbone team is like the hamster on the wheel getting it done, and we are leading and guiding it from a leadership role. But there's always that opportunity, and it's a critical vetting process to go back to your steering committee leaders just to validate that the direction you're going is exactly what you heard them say. We provide information that helps them think even higher, go deep or lower in the weeds with us. But it's a really great opportunity to touch on the work and ensure that we're going through the tactics and the milestones and of all of this, and it's moving in the right direction. So the steering committee isn't behind the scenes doing the heavy lift. They are really your thought leaders. They are really connecting you and linking you and giving you direction. And the backbone team, I believe, is like that hamster on the wheel that's always keeping the engine moving, that's always doing that pre-work to keep everyone aware and communicating, pushing information out and receiving information back in from others, encouraging relationship building among all of the steering committee members so that it creates a larger footprint for the work.
Cheryl, you feeling like a hamster on a wheel lately?
Sometimes, but I have 3 steering committees now.
Yeah, I know. You've got a lot going on. Yeah,
that could be happening.
Yeah, but I think that wheel is moving, so I think that's absolutely great. Yeah, I think one other dimension I would add to that is we are familiar with sort of the organizational differences between the board, who is typically voluntary and representative of the community and various dimensions of the issue and bring sort of key influence as board members, and then the staff. And the backbone really functions as staffing the collective impact initiative, and steering committee members you can think of as more sort of representative of the community, but sort of board level in nature. Great. So why don't we move on to the next section of today, and we're going to talk a bit about including the voices of the community, and I'm going to turn it back to Erin.
Great. Thanks, John. So I'll say that this is a topic that is certainly worthy of many, many webinars because it is so absolutely critical. I'll focus my remarks today a little more on just a framing for how you think about engaging community members and how you might want to focus on it early on. But I certainly encourage you to check out the variety of resources available on the CI forum that talk about some tactics and some of the reasoning behind engaging community. Okay, so just starting out with who is this community that we talk about? You can define your community in many ways. It might be the formal system leaders that we've talked about. This section, I really want to focus on the individual who has the lived experience of the problem, who's waking up every day in the midst of the problem, dealing with it, the impact, and impact on the lives of people around him or her. That's the community. That you can think of that individual as potentially the end user of imperfect systems. But that is a critical part and honestly the center of the work. If you go back to that asthma wellness challenge that Cheryl showed earlier, it had the child and the family, that community at the center. Next slide, please. So why do you engage these community members? Sort of like, why do you spend the time and energy to do it? There are 3 main purposes or reasons for engaging community. So one, at the bottom, that foundational understanding of the challenge. Perhaps you are a nonprofit in the community, you serve individuals, you might have a pretty good understanding of the challenges they face. Many do not. So really spending time early on talking to community members, even as part of that process of forming a steering committee, will help everyone better understand the challenges. And frankly, to build some empathy, to really walk in the shoes of someone else. Another way, sort of later on in the process, or another reason to engage community is to really help develop strategies. You might be testing, you might be piloting, getting feedback, might be spending time in a room together with them, helping to draft out strategies that make sense. Ultimately, to sustain the change, this is the sort of to do change with, not to, an individual. As we think about the young asthma patients in Dallas, it was important to understand more about their lives and their families' lives before we told someone, just go out and be a compliant patient, to really understand some of the barriers to compliance, right? So to really help involve them in the ultimate change. So that's why you might engage community. So I'd like to go ahead and just launch a quick poll as we get started to better understand, some of you on the phone, how have you engaged community members? So there are just a few choices here. I realize there are many other means. A, a larger group setting, kind of a town hall meeting. B, something that feels closer in, a focus group or a home visit. C, you're engaging them as members of a steering committee. D, as partners, sort of in grassroots advocacy or classic organizing. Or maybe another that I haven't even thought about yet, haven't engaged community members yet. So unsurprising for early on in a process, we're seeing a number of folks who haven't yet engaged community members. And I say unsurprising because early on there's often a couple of folks, a couple of early champions, maybe some funders who have a great deal of passion and commitment to the effort, but haven't yet begun that longer process of directly asking for community input. And as long as it does happen, it doesn't necessarily have to happen right at the outset. I think the top way that you guys are engaging with community is in a closer setting, it looks like, maybe even tied with members of the steering committee, that you're doing focus groups and home visits. That sounds like a really good way to get a better understanding of the problem or challenge that individuals are facing. Kudos to those of you who are including community members as members of your steering committee. This can be absolutely sort of transformational for other steering committee members to have folks in the room who understand the problem because they live it. It can also, as I mentioned earlier, create some sort of structural dynamics to try and work through, even as far as timing of meetings or childcare. So it definitely looks like you're doing that range of engagement activities. There's not one perfect activity or not one perfect means to engage the community. Next slide. This slide sort of just illustrates that there's a bit of a spectrum of ways that you engage with members of the community. You might just do something more informational, a town hall that says, hey guys, there's this great effort that's coming together. We'd like some initial input. You might do something that looks more like consulting, that's sort of going out and really asking good questions, doing focus groups, interviews, or home visits. You might involve and collaborate with them in developing the solutions. They're part of the steering committee, they're part of working groups, they're helping you develop strategies. This co-leadership piece is really interesting. I think a great example from the health space is ultimately engaging community residents as community health workers to deliver training or education. So that's an example of really getting the community to be totally part of the solution and also help lead it. So again, a variety of ways. You're not going to do all of this at once right at the beginning, but you should be thinking from the outset, how and where am I engaging community? Next slide, please. This isn't easy. It's not easy for us at FSG. It's not easy for our partners because there are a few common challenges that pop up. Number one is just, who is this community I should engage? And then what are the means of the many ways you can engage them as members and focus group participants, as co-leaders, understanding who to engage and how. Can take some time. And sometimes we just skip over it because it's a challenge, but much better to look at it, to talk about it with a few people in the community and start down that path. A second challenge is the balancing efficiency and effectiveness. So effectiveness says that in order to be successful in community change, you have to involve the community in the change. Efficiency says we got to move pretty quickly, and it's a little bit challenging for me to schedule all these focus groups and home visits and for us to have town halls, and maybe we're going to get feedback that means we have to change our plan. Well, that is the balance. Again, there's no formula to this, but being mindful that ultimately you can probably create more transformational change by taking some time at the outset to involve the community than not. The final piece is overcoming obstructive norms, and this means essentially the norms in any given community that prevent people from working together effectively. They may be norms that have to do with racial differences, economic differences, heck, even neighborhood differences. But recognizing here are some dynamics in the community that make it hard for people to talk to each other and work together. We won't get it right the first time, but we want to try and find ways to work our way through them. Next slide, please. Just a couple of steps to keep in mind when engaging community. Number one, define it. Who are these individuals? You might ask yourself, who's living with the problem every day? What demographics are most at risk? You want to get feedback along the way. You want to say to your steering committee, to those you meet, how are we doing on this? You want to ask community members, keep us honest. Are we doing a good job in reaching out to you along the way? And then you want to course correct. It's okay to say, we're not doing this right. Let's go in a different direction. Along with that comes just addressing the tension, put it on the table, recognize there might be some conflict that comes up when you start to bring together pieces of the system and individuals who use that system. And choose the right method. Again, no magic answer here, but starting with a method and then evolving it over time, doing some focus groups, moving into another type of setting, I think that's a really good, just a good approach to continue to think about. I'd love to turn it over now to Cheryl, who can talk a bit more about exactly how this human-centered design work, a great form of community engagement, played out in Dallas in asthma. Cheryl?
Thank you, Erin. As you can see from the slide, this is a picture of a mom and her child, and we had conversations with several families as we began this work, and Mom shared with us her experience, and we also spoke with her son. So beginning the work with what we call the human-centered design approach, keeping the end user at the core of why you're doing the work is really, really important. And we started this back in 2012. We spoke to about 30 families for about 4 months in South and West Dallas. We hosted community gatherings, and we did what we call design studios with 100-plus people, children and adults. And we used these insights to ground the Alliance and our other programming. We thought about what are our folks saying, what are the families saying, and how can we use this to partner with them and not prescribe. That's a core design of human-centered design. Because as you start looking at the strategies that you will build, you really want folks that you're speaking to, the families, the child, right around the table with you so they can co-create the opportunities. Think of it this way. I was early in the work as one of the community members around the table being approached during Meet the Neighbor, and I said to the gentleman from Children's Health, Peter Roberts, who came to visit with me, Peter, whatever you do, just don't come into our communities and helicopter in, drop off a Kaboom playground, or drop a box of food that the kids run over to like a helicopter, and then leave us. Let's do this work together. Ground yourself. Put in a stake in the community where our families are and really hang around. So this human-centered design is really a mindset, and it's a practice. It's our way of seeking to understand the experiences, and when I say experiences, the feelings, the events, things that people have been through, listening to their stories. This involves the people we serve, so it's really important that we listen to them. This helped us identify gaps between what people need and what the system is providing. At the end of the day, whatever you create, whatever you co-create with families, you want to make sure it sticks. You want to make sure that they own it. You want to walk away as a backbone team from the work because the community of stakeholders, the community of residents, the community of families and children will own this work themselves, and they kind of decide what their journey will be as they partner in this work. So from this human-centered design, you have your slide deck back at the beginning when we showed you that balance equation. We learned from these families the key elements of wellness. So we knew that in order to really identify those levers, identify the theory of change important to our work. That family, that child, that community needed to be around the table to tell us about the balanced outlook, to tell us what was a sense of self, what did that mean for them, how did they build resilience, how did they gain agency to do it themselves when no one else is looking. So it was really important, as I said, for us to speak to that mom, speak to that child, and also talk to our community leaders as well to get them to hear the stories of our families. And this helped us stay focused on the real reason why they were invited to the table and the real reason why we were doing the work. Thanks, Erin. John?
I'm gonna hop in with a story, and if we could switch to the next slide, please. So, talking a little bit about community ownership in Dallas, and this is actually yet another initiative that we've been involved in working on in the Dallas area. You see a picture here. It's called WINS, Working in Neighborhoods Strategically is the name of the initiative. It is an effort that's in South Dallas, representing 3 zip codes that you can see here in the picture. This is one of the most challenges, currently one of the poorest areas in the Dallas region, encompassing these 3 zip codes. Over time, it's been an area that's been separated by numerous highways. The area has lost 50% of its population between 1970 and the year 2000, including much of what was a vibrant African-American middle class that was living there. It's an area that, on the one hand, is very challenged. On the other hand, it is an area that includes a number of great community organizations and leaders, and a spirited set of folks who live there. And I want to talk just about the effort to sort of engage the community really at the beginning of this process. We were importantly, Erin said earlier, it's ideal if you can involve those that are living with the problem and the challenges on the steering committee. So on the steering committee, we have both residents alongside a cross-sector group of organizations, professionals from organizations that are working in the community. And I want to talk just a little bit about our engagement right up front as we were beginning to develop a common agenda. It was a neat effort, and we haven't done this in every engagement, but I really liked the way we went about it here, and it's an interesting way to think about engaging the community. We started with the steering committee, and again, we had residents alongside professionals from a cross-sector set of organizations, and we asked, in terms of just trying to get a sense of, what was going on in the community. So we collected a lot of data, but we wanted to go out and talk to the community. So we asked each steering committee member to actually go do 5 conversations, interviews, and actually to have those occur in the homes of residents. So we built a list of folks that we thought would be great for the steering committee members to talk to, and they actually contributed to the list. So it was really, a set of folks that, we were really excited about going to talk to, that were representative of the community. And, each steering committee member went out and had a conversation, typically during the evening, but at different times of day, in the homes of, these individuals and their families. And then they took notes, and, the results of these interviews were tabulated. And then we presented and the steering committee presented the findings at a community meeting. And when we were sort of trying to get out word about the community meeting, each steering committee member invited the 5 that they'd interviewed, the 5 individuals or family they'd interviewed, plus another 5 or 10 people. And then they told others, and of course we, put out communication about it. But we had this level of personal contact, so to the point where we actually had several hundred individuals that came to hear about the findings. And when the findings were presented, And in this case, we were asking people what sort of issues they thought in South Dallas should be addressed and could benefit from a collective approach. So issues that came up were issues you wouldn't find surprising: safety, education, health, housing, economic development. But when we presented each of these areas, we had not only a steering committee present what we found, we talked to the community, but we had a community member who, in the course of the interviews and conversations, we found to be particularly passionate about, say, safety or housing. We had them get up and share their perspectives. And we actually rehearsed those individuals because many folks aren't, super comfortable or have a lot of experience with public speaking. So we actually rehearsed the folks that we asked to actually speak on behalf of the community from the community. And that was really super powerful just in terms of sharing with the community, engaging the community, to have people from the community actually sharing how they felt. And then we collected the results from that. We took those results back. We continued to do additional analysis on key issue areas. And then we invited the community back yet a second time to share the final analysis, gather their input on the areas that were selected for the community to focus on. And then we, at that time, also asked for additional volunteers to be involved at both the steering committee and the working group levels, the next level of work getting done. So, I could go on about what's happened since then. I'm giving you just a small snapshot of, how we, in a very vigorous and energizing way, engage the community right at the outset of this initiative. So if we could switch to the next slide, please. So what we're going to do, I'm going to give you some final wrap-up thoughts, and then, yes, we've got a good 20 minutes or so to handle questions, and a bunch have come in, and I've written them down, and I'm going to facilitate Q&A. But before I do that, just a couple of final lessons on this slide and the next, and then we'll go to Q&A. You've heard Erin and Cheryl talk at length about relationships. And at the end of the day, relationships are the fabric of collective impact. I'm sure many on the phone have heard the expression, change happens at the speed of trust. And there is no other way that we get to transformational outcomes in this work than through building strong relationships, and that starts with the steering committee. This work takes time. I want to come back in Q&A if we have time to asking Cheryl about, meet the neighbor, and a lot of the sort of time-intensive activities that Erin talked about. But at the end of the day, there's no replacement for this. And the sum net of collective impact efforts to make progress at scale do take 3 to 5 to 7 years. And people often say to me, how could that, 3 to 5 to 7 years, nobody has the patience for that. And my answer, which is quasi-flip, is, well, 3 to 5 to 7 years, that's better than never, because that's what we got right now. How about never making progress at scale on the issue? This work takes time. Speed versus inclusion. Erin talked a bit about this, that there is this constant tension between, we can't have a cajillion people on the steering committee and, involved in the work, but we do want to be inclusive in this work. And it's a critical question that the steering committee always needs to keep at the center as they are, guiding the initiative. Do we need to be slowing down? Do we need to be speeding up? Do we need to be including more? There's no perfect answer to this, but the question always needs to be asked. Facilitation matters. Peter Senge, who's one of my great mentors in systems thinking, talks about the aesthetic of the meeting. At the core of collective impact work is bringing powerful data and setting up good dialogue and deep listening so that people can come to perspectives that are, in fact, transformational. And it's more than just coming with an agenda. It's things like thinking about the setup of the room, ensuring that there's plenty of time for engagement, and thinking about ways that you can actually, move people around even physically to help them learn in new ways. And these groups are always fluid. They will and they should change over time. They'll change because you turn over new stones and discover things that you didn't know about the issue that involve representation of new individuals. They will change because, fundamentally not everybody, can be involved for 3 to 5 to 7 years, and the needs of the steering committee will change. And, flip to the next slide. Along the lines of the fact that things will change, the needs will change over time. This just gives you a bit of a picture. We talk about typically 3 stages or phases of collective impact: initiating impact action, organizing for impact, and developing strategies and sustaining impact. And there's this pre-stage, if you will, of scope and readiness. And you can see here that the steering committee's doing and focused on different things in these stages. So in the scope and readiness and in early stages of the effort, figuring out who needs to be at the table and getting them there. And once we're into the action phase and organizing for impact, getting to know and trust each other. And then once we're actually into the strategies and into the work, leveraging membership expertise and relationships and bringing on new voices. So keep in mind that the nature of the work for the steering committee will evolve over time. So we've got time for a bunch of questions, and I think that's the next slide. Let me see. So here's a question for either of you. So a couple of people have asked, do you identify the issue first and work with a smaller group to do that, or does the steering committee decide on the issue? There's a bit of a chicken and the egg question. Which comes first, the steering committee or the issue identified? Cheryl or Erin, any thoughts on that?
This is Erin. So I actually think Cheryl has some good experience with this. I think in some cases, like in the asthma work, we knew that child health would be, front and center. It would be an issue broadly defined of child health, but that felt too broad to make progress. The hospital was a key partner, and others, sort of look at the data, start to see asthma is popping as an issue, and then go out and have good conversations with folks and get feedback that indeed that's a good place to start as an issue. But it sounds like in the Collin County example, Cheryl, you're actually starting more with people and the conversation, and then going to the issue. Is that right?
Absolutely. We decided that we would look at engaging those families so that we could be strategic about not only an issue, but if it should be a place-based approach from what our families tell us. So what John has referred to in the WINS example, that is a place-based initiative that is focused on those 3 zip codes with residents around the table. When we chose asthma, it was a clinical issue that wasn't necessarily targeted to a zip code or a specific community to help us with the work. So in our Collin County initiative, we are looking to let it kind of emerge from our learnings from engaging the families and how important it is to target quickly and use the resources in a smaller area to pilot and demonstrate that change we've desired.
Yeah. So I think in both of those answers you hear, the answer to the question, issue come first or steering committee, the answer is it depends. And, it ends up being very context-based based on the issue. Is it, a neighborhood-based initiative, or is it, issue-based like asthma? And, really who are the catalysts that are coming forward? Typically, it's 2 or 3 influential members. They could either be community members or members of organizations who come forward and want to catalyze around a particular issue. And where it goes from there, really, I think it depends in terms of how quickly the issue, the focus on the issue gets formed. Certainly bringing steering committee members together, you want them to have a sense of what it is that they are working on, as we talked about earlier. Here's another question. No community out there is a blank sheet of paper. So, there's a question about if we're bringing people together, sort of 2 things that this person identified in the question. One is there may be coalitions that are already addressing the issue. And yet here, you might be catalyzing an effort around this. And what do you do about that? And then the second sort of lack of a blank sheet of paper is that the answer might come from that you hear when you're bringing people together, particularly folks from the nonprofit sector who are working on the issue that, this isn't necessarily about collective impact, it's just about more services, and that's what we need. So I'm curious, Erin and Cheryl, if you have any thoughts on those two questions about, bringing people together with some, preconceived notions of what should happen.
I'll start with that first. This is Cheryl question with the collaboratives. In our Collin County work, one of the things we did notice were there were quite a few collaboratives that were in existence. And so we intentionally brought them around the table as part of the core group, the leaders of those, because it gave us opportunity to listen to what was happening over the length of their collaborative, how we might garner the support they have, the influence they have, how we might even use lessons learned from them in a community that we haven't even started our work. So collaborating with collaboratives is key, because the last thing we wanted to do was come in, and I think I said this earlier, and present that no one's been doing it right and here we are to save the day, and that's certainly not what collective impact is about, or this work and really trying to get at change in a big way. So validating the work of collaboratives, bringing them around the table, and again, celebrating what they're doing well and looking at how we might even continue those things or tweak some of the things that they said were barriers or that were difficult experiences they had had.
That's great, Cheryl. Erin, what are your perspectives on, sometimes people coming to these efforts, particularly if they're working on the issue, the first sort of bias is that more services are needed, or they're showing up because they're sort of hoping that there will be more money for them. Is that something we run into?
I'd say at every initiative. I think it's pretty common to have folks who are, frankly, making their way to great outcomes for the individuals they serve with, duct tape and a lot of passion, to want more resource, or to assume that maybe if I get involved in this and there are a couple of funders, maybe more money will come. I think it's fine if they have that perspective. We all come to a meeting because we think we might get something out of it. But very quickly making it clear that part of the power of this work is getting more efficiency out of the existing resource in the existing system. And, that can be sometimes frustrating, but also that's where you get your early wins, where you identify an area where just slightly better coordination could create some powerful early changes in the way the system operates. And once you start to see that, I think people usually say, okay, this is about more than just money. I also think if the group comes together, you identify usually like a policy agenda, a few policies that will be really helpful. Some of those might have money attached to them. You might also identify a funding agenda. So rather than each individual organization saying, we need more money for services, at my entity, it's more of the power of collective saying, here are a few areas in the community, whether it's locations or types of services, that really and truly are gaps, where there's not just a coordination play. And I think if you can highlight as a collective how you've come to that agenda, typically funders are excited, and I think we're also seeing a lot of federal government funding flows going in that way as well, of the community having identified a few gaps. So just a couple of thoughts there, John.
Yeah, and I think and you, obviously you can't do this out of the box, but I think one of the things that we see repeatedly is that why people may show up because they feel the primary benefit would be access to new dollars. That if the effort is well facilitated and well structured, that they will see fairly immediately the benefit through the learning that they're getting about the issue that allows them to be more impactful in their work, and ultimately to be better at results that will hopefully drive additional funding opportunities. Here's a question: is it better we're talking about the steering committee? Folks. And Cheryl, you alluded a little bit to this as you talked about sort of maybe how you thought about sort of different types of players involved in a collective impact initiative. But the specific question is, for the steering committee, is it better to invite decision makers or people who are willing to do the work? That
is a great question, and I think there's a need for the balance of both. because you do need worker bees. You need people that understand the community that you're going to be serving, that understand the work. And generally, those aren't your C-suite folks that are out there touching lives or delivering program or understand the metrics or have their pulse on what's really happening, what I would call your ground game. And you also need an air game. You need folks that think at a higher level, that connect dots in the different sectors around your community. You need someone that has an experience and the respect of that higher level system thinking group that perhaps your backbone team doesn't have access, or you need them to communicate the work you're doing. So a balance of both. I referred to also early in the work, I found that we were building. And when you're building work, it's slow, it's generally hard, you're pivoting quite often, you refer back to your data, you regroup your team. Things may not go the way you plan, but you're certainly moving forward because you're measuring, you're looking for those key players that you've brought in along the way. That's that ground game that you might not want a CEO in the room or a president of a health system hearing that, because they're busy people, and you really only get one shot, I think, at bringing them in and getting them connected and understanding what you're doing. So you have to be strategic about who, when, and someone that has the time and the understanding of the slow work that we're trying to do. So I don't think it's going to be the same for every collective, for every group, but you want to be mindful of who you have around the table and who do you have that can help you think at a higher level, and who do you have that can help you really get at that ground game so that you have quick wins, you're building early momentum and traction in the work.
Yep, great. Terrific. Erin, anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay,
I know we have a list of other questions.
That's fine. Cool. Let's try another question here. A couple of different questions on how to avoid partners starting to regard themselves as customers instead of really owners and partners and doers in the work. Any thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question as well. And I will say, personally, where I found for the leader of the work as a backbone person, one of the things I didn't do well, I thought we could have improved on, and we are starting to do that, is really using the tenets of collective impact to remind the players around the table the rules of engagement. When that starts happening, I tend to look inside and say, how am I presenting? What are the signals I'm sending out? How am I engaging that group? And that might be a little bit too much ownership on backbone team, but it does speak to, are we really being collaborative, and are we all showing up from those guiding principles and how we said we would work? So I use the collective impact methodology to really continue to remind the players of how we've agreed to come to the table. And it helps me have an honest conversation without having the hard conversation unless I absolutely need to. Because aligning activities means that's a verb. You're doing something. We are working together. We're looking for those areas where we can connect the dots. So I truly believe using those tenets to help guide the way you work and the direction you're going, and holding those steering committee members around the table to this method.
Yeah.
But not being rigid. I'm not saying be rigid. Right. I'm just saying be mindful.
That joint accountability. Yep. Peer pressure is not a bad thing, right? Yep.
Absolutely not.
Good. Here's a question. We currently have the engagement of community members. However, how do you make the room more equal so that those in higher positions do not focus on titles, but rather all people as the same?
Wow, John, this is Erin. Great question there. I think there are just a few kind of observations from the work that I'd share. So one is that actually don't use titles in collective impact. I don't call people doctor or whatever their title may be. That's one of the first ones, actually, is to just, here's my friend Bob. Even if Bob has a PhD, it doesn't actually matter. He's coming because he represents part of the system and a perspective. I think the other is to remind folks that that content versus context expertise. So we're not lacking for any amount of great best practices or deep expertise in the problem. There are awesome best practices out there. There are a lot of experts. If that's the case, if we have all of that, why are we still not making change at scale? Well, it's probably because we're not working together well as a community. So how can we, I think just setting that expectation early on and reminding folks that it's not necessarily about the best practice, it's bringing the best practice in to a new way of working. And part of that way of working is to truly treat each other as equals. I think a third way is just to make sure you're giving room for everyone in a meeting. So that comes from good facilitation, an active facilitator, someone actually running the meeting who's not afraid to cut people off or redirect. And then the other piece of well-structured meeting is a facilitation plan that includes opportunities where you're prompting everyone to speak up, where there's some sort of opportunity not just for a big open discussion, but for active engagement by individuals. So there's just a couple thoughts, but this is absolutely critical. I'm so glad that folks are focused on this question.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is as much as you can focus the conversations around problem solving and around problem solving so that it's not focused on what people, what organizations are doing, but collectively how you're trying to understand what's going on, whether or not it's asthma wellness or child obesity or teen substance abuse or poverty. And I think, to the facilitation point, I think one of the things that we found really useful is not, never stick the most important people up in front of the rest of the people, like in a panel, looking at everybody else. How you mix up the room, how you engage in small group discussions within a steering committee. Somebody had asked typically what's the size of a steering committee. We typically think about 25 to 30 people. That's good enough to get you representation. Once you get over 30 people, it gets really challenging to have effective conversations. Not to say that there aren't steering committees that are more than 30 people, but the ability to actually break the, as you're doing meetings, to look at data, have small group discussions that mix different people, to interpret the data, lots of different facilitative techniques that try to sort of, equalize the power equation, because we have to recognize that that's there. So we spend a lot of time thinking about that, and increasingly I think we've been doing this work intensively at this point, collective impact work in communities for 4 years. We spend more and more time thinking about what are facilitative techniques and approaches that sort of equalize that. You're never going to get rid of it completely, but how do you get folks together working on seeing the problem from different sides, in ways that they, can have productive conversations. So that's really super important to the work. There's a question here about best practices for diverse, it's maybe a good follow-on question to what we were just talking about. Best practices for making decisions within a diverse group where people's perspectives don't align. Should you be trying to go for majority vote, consensus, allowing people to opt out? What sort of experiences have you both had with that in terms of decision-making processes? Is there one perfect one?
I don't think there's one perfect one, and what I coach the team to do when we run into situations like this is to always have a way in our meetings to capture all thoughts. So I think most of you will be used to having parking lots. So that's a way to say, wow, that's a great idea, that's a great perspective. I don't, as a team member, as a backbone team, understand all the components about that. How about I write this here? I give you a call after the meeting. We learn a little bit more so we can present more details to the team. Generally, our group doesn't go to vote. So we use data, we use evidence-based, community-led. We provide and try to have a screening or filter so that our approach to decision-making is consistent. It's not, yes, let's do that, or no, let's not do that. It's driven by data, it's driven by evidence, it's driven by community capacity, it's driven by lead partners. So you create this template, if you will, that helps you ask the team a lot of questions. So the team and the group comes up with, wow, we still have some gaps in the answers to our questions. We can't make a decision if this is the right direction to move next in this, the tactics around our logic model and the next steps or our input or our output. So you kind of have a plan of action and you stay by that plan of action, but those, what I call the guiding principles, how we show up, is consistent all the time, which in the end will create the natural way that decisions kind of are guided by those things I listed earlier. Erin?
Yeah, that's a great point, Cheryl. I think a lot of times this work is more consensus-based, and there's a bit of reading the room or reading the tea leaves, as my colleague John likes to say, to understand what's the dynamic. If this is where having a good facilitator or having, and it might not be the backbone lead, it might be the steering committee chairs running the meeting, and that individual knows that we need to get good consensus on a decision. And if the room is not ready, if there are a lot of folks sharing, really strong counter perspectives, then it might not be time to make that decision. There might need to be more information, more discussion before we get there. And I think there are some great facilitation techniques you can use, different types of voting mechanisms. But in general, you won't expect that steering committee meetings sort of have a vote moment on occasion, perhaps, but not that frequently.
Great, thanks. Well, we're going to need to turn to our final thoughts, and then I'm going to turn it back to Robert Albright to close us out. So I think the next slide, please. So who wants to start? Erin, what are your closing thoughts for our audience in terms of setting the stage for collective impact, setting the scene?
Thanks, John. I think that it's really just important to keep in mind that you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere with community engagement. You have to start somewhere with a steering committee. It will evolve over time. You will absolutely make a couple of mistakes along the way of getting formed. So at some point, you just decide this is our go-forward group for the first meeting, and then be intentional and really, truly reflective about learning and saying, it felt like we were missing a big sector, or that individual mentioned they didn't feel like the community's voice is being heard. So, starting somewhere and then being intentional and reflecting and learning and changing along the way, because there's not that perfect mix of people for the first meeting and not one perfect way of engaging community.
Great, thank you. Cheryl, final thoughts?
I'd like to just thank you guys for being on the call and just wish you the best as you go out to really change the world in a big, huge way. Again, being mindful that it does take time, and the relationships that you build, the relationships that you have now, will give you the natural instinct to have the honest and genuine conversations with key stakeholders in your community. One thing I've learned is you don't have all the answers, and that's okay. And your passion to get it done, your experience in what you're doing well now will help guide you and push you into this next space that you're in. And continue to look for ways to meet new people. Go to spaces you've never been in. So stretch yourself outside of what you're comfortable doing, so that when you start building this team, you do have a cross-sector. You have folks that I believe that a great meeting has a little bit of a sandpaper feel, and that's probably not a great example, but everyone's thinking, everyone's challenging, is this right? And it's challenged and it's guided in a really positive team way. But never get just the same thinkers like yourself around the room, and you won't know who those other thinkers are if you don't go out to different meetings, to different spaces, to maybe a faith-based or perhaps a health system if you're not in health or nonprofit. Move outside of your normal sphere of work and get to meet some different folks that you are aware of who's in your community and what your community is doing that you might want to bring to the table. And my last statement is, don't forget the families, don't forget the kids, and bring them in early and as quickly as possible so that you're always looking at your work from that end user, from that human center, from the person who you want to support and help along the way.
Great. Thanks to you both. My parting thoughts are very brief. Stay dedicated to the health of the whole, and in selecting a steering committee, look for others that are dedicated to the health of the whole. Next slide, please. So I've very much enjoyed this time. I want to share what my appreciation for all of the work that all of you are doing, as Cheryl did. I think you're all amazing to take on this work. I want to thank my two co-panelists, Cheryl and Erin. You two are people that I have great admiration for, and hopefully the audience does after hearing the two of you speak. And I'm going to turn it back right now to Robert Albright to close us out.
Great. Thanks, John, and thank you all for joining us today for setting the scene for collective impact. We hope you really enjoyed the presentation, and as John mentioned, just wanted to thank Cheryl and Erin for joining along with John for a really rich discussion the past 90 minutes. You can continue your collective impact journey with us in our upcoming webinar, Collaborating to Create a Common Agenda, which is coming up on November 3rd. And just a few other final points. You can find today's PowerPoint slides and handout material on collectiveimpactforum.org. You will also be receiving an email with direct links shortly. Please join the forum to access even more information, materials, and networks around collective impact. And we ask that you take a moment and complete the evaluation that will appear on your screen. Your comments and suggestions are so important to us as they help us to adjust our programming to best meet your needs. So in closing, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to continuing the conversation. Have a great day.